Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the law catching up with Donald Trump and the Trump Organization with the announcement by New York Attorney General Letitia James that, quote, "We have informed the Trump Organization that our investigation into the organization is no longer purely civil in nature. We are now actively investigating the Trump Organization in a criminal capacity, along with the Manhattan DA." Joining us is Kimberly Whaley, an author, lawyer, and professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, who was a former assistant U.S. attorney and an associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation, whose forthcoming book is The Outsourced Constitution: How Government Power in Private Hands Erodes American Democracy. We will discuss her article at The Atlantic, "The Country is on the Cusp of a New Era. America is inching closer to a possibility it has never seen before, the indictment and trial of a former president." Then we'll assess the extent of a possible thaw in the frosty relations between the U.S. and Russia following a meeting between the U.S. Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister on the sideline of the Arctic Council meeting in Iceland, where they worked on preparations for a Biden-Putin summit. William Pomerantz, the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., joins us to discuss the waiving of U.S. sanctions on the Russian Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which Germany has sought and Ukraine opposes. Then finally, we'll examine the signing today by President Biden of a law targeting hate crimes against Asian Americans and speak with one of the people responsible for bringing attention to the fact that over the last year, more than 6,600 anti-Asian hate incidents have been recorded nationwide by the nonprofit Stop AAPI Hate. Dr. Russell Young, a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University, who is the founder of Stop Asian American and Pacific Islander Hate, joins us to discuss this bipartisan bill, now law, that 63 Republican House members voted against. And before we begin, as the toxic cloud of the tragic Trump years lifts and we gear up to rebuild our broken country and heal our endangered world, we at Background Briefing will soon have to rely on your support at backgroundbriefing.org/donate to keep broadcasting on affiliates and online at backgroundbriefing.org, as either the Pacifica Network goes bankrupt or the dysfunctional and destructive Pacifica boards take Background Briefing off the air in retaliation for my advocacy for professional management and financial transparency. When we move fully to online broadcasting, we will be depending on you, our growing global and national community of listeners, to sustain us for as little as $5 a month to keep this program independent, corporate-free, and accessible to those not in a position to contribute at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. And I thank you for your support. And joining us now is Kimberly Whaley, who's an author, lawyer, media commentator, and professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. She's also a former assistant United States attorney, associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation, and the author of How to Read the Constitution and Why, What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, and the forthcoming book, Outsourced Constitution: How Government Power in Private Hands Erodes American Democracy. And she has an article at The Atlantic, "The Country is on the Cusp of a New Era. America is inching closer to a possibility it has never seen before, the indictment and trial of a former president." Welcome to Background Briefing, Kimberly Whaley.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Kimberly. And on the other side of the ledger, if you will, it looks as if the Republican Senate is going to give Trump a third free pass. They've let him off the hook with impeachments, and now they're letting him off the hook with an investigation into what happened on January the 6th and Trump's possible role in it.
Yeah, well, they're letting some of themselves off the hook as well, because, you know, the looming question here for the American people isn't so much the accountability for the citizens who participated in the actual riots. There's over, I think, 400 either criminal investigations or charges already brought across the country against the rioters. But what happened on that day? What is the breakdown that justified that nightmare on Capitol Hill, both in terms of what happened in the White House and also reports of certain members of Congress who are complicit in that, the lead up to that moment. And of course, we also saw a majority or many Republicans vote down certification of the Electoral College votes on that very day. So I think there's a couple things there. There's, as you say, once again, giving Donald Trump a pass, which is very dangerous for democracy. But also, I think they're covering their own tracks, and they have their eyes squarely set on the midterms and the hope that perhaps the House and or the Senate will go to the Republicans. And as I also wrote in a piece in the Bulwark this week, or maybe it was last week, they're paving the way, essentially, for if Joe Biden or a Democrat were to win in 4 years the presidency, that a January 6, 2025 could see, if we have a Republican-dominated Congress, a refusal to gavel in that presidency. So this is very, very serious. We are one election away from the end of American democracy, and we're seeing the Republican Party in lockstep with basically the demise of government by we the people. And that's not a political statement. That's a statement coming from, someone who studies the Constitution and applies common sense and logic to what we're seeing right now. This is not democracy, what the Republican Party is supporting. It's something else. It's just not democracy.
Well, given that both Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House, and the former majority leader, now minority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, both after January the 6th castigated Trump in no uncertain manner, and McConnell actually went much, much further and even sort of told the Democrats that you can sue this guy. But he's changed his tune totally. So then you have to ask yourself, Kimberly, why? And the answer, the only one that I ever hear, is that, they're terrified of the base because the base loves Trump. So if there is to be a trial of Trump, then they had better have their ducks in a row, because how else will you dispel the adulation in this kind of cult worship that exists for Trump?
Well, I think part of it is that they're worried about the base, but they're also worried about having a focus through this commission at the end of this year being on what happened on January 6th. And as I said, how ugly that is. It's not going to look good for the Republican Party and for candidates across the country, regardless of support for Trump. As far as how to switch to sort of shift the narrative, it's very, very difficult when the former president continues to lie about the legitimacy of the election, and members of Congress continue to support the big lie. We also saw Liz Cheney, Republican from Wyoming, third-ranking member of the Republican Party, thrown out of her leadership position last week. Why? Because she was actually speaking the truth and upholding democracy. The Washington Post counted over 3,000 lies coming out of Donald Trump's White House in the last 4 years. This is a sort of right out of the pages of sort of historical slippages of democracy into authoritarianism, sort of lying to the public, just attacking the media, sort of discounting any critique coming from the other side, putting people in places of power, including in the court system, that are going to run politics and not the rule of law. All of this is a slow drip towards something other than what the framers established. And we're a very young democracy. I don't know how to turn that narrative around other than the Republican Party as a whole standing up for the rule of law. And as you say, they're much more entrenched in keeping power in this moment than saving the structure itself for the long term. And it's really, really tragic. It's not only tragic, it's deeply unethical. And there are very, very good Republicans out there that care about policy, and people should vote the current Republican Party that's adhering to the big lie out of office if they want to have government by the people for their children and grandchildren. Democrats, Republicans, independents, every American has to understand the other side of democracy is dark. It's dark for all of us. And we just need to get back to the business of actually having government decided by the people for the people and not by entrenched politicians based on lies.
And again, I'm speaking with Kimberly Whaley, an author, lawyer, media commentator, and professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. She's also a former assistant United States attorney, associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation, and author of How to Read the Constitution and Why, What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, and the forthcoming book, The Outsourced Constitution, How Government Power in the Private Hands Erodes American Democracy. And she has an article at The Atlantic, The Country is on the Cusp of a New Era. America is inching closer to a possibility as never seen before, the indictment and trial of a former president. And what we haven't seen before, even before this possible trial takes place, given that the New York Attorney General has joined forces with the Manhattan DA to look into the Trump Organization in a criminal capacity, we have never had a situation where a former president has the kind of influence that Trump has. I mean, Trump controls the GOP, and they're all sort of genuflecting, including McConnell and McCarthy. So, again, do you think that, I mean, to some extent, Michael Cohen sort of hinted at what the roadmap was when he testified before the Congress back in 2019. But let's talk about some of the vulnerabilities that Trump has with the excessive valuation of the Seven Springs 213-acre estate that he has in Westchester County, which was used to claim a $21.1 million tax deduction, and also a $160 million loan on a property at 40 Wall Street, etc. And this is short of going into his relationship with Deutsche Bank, where the assumption has been that the only reason why this bank gave him a lot of money and nobody else would was that those loans were guaranteed probably by Russian oligarchs working for Putin. So just on what I've just listed now, do you feel that there are strong cases developing, Kimberly?
Well, I do, just because of the fact that now, as you indicated this week, we've seen Letitia Jones, the state AG, say that her exclusively civil investigation is now essentially joining forces with the Manhattan DA on a criminal matter. So that suggests the trajectory is ramping up, not ramping down. And as you indicated, they're basically, as far as we know publicly, of course, grand jury investigations are secret, but we know publicly is that there are three areas that are in the sights now of the state and local prosecutors in New York. One is whether Donald Trump lied on financial applications for loans, basically overvaluing his properties in order to justify big loans. Number two, whether he lied in the other way on his tax returns, undervaluing property so he doesn't have to pay taxes. And then number three, and both of those things, as you indicated, Michael Cohen sort of, the part of the investigation was triggered by his congressional testimony saying, like, listen, this is what he did. And Michael Cohen has publicly said that he's met with government lawyers at least 8 times and has not only confirmed that in terms of his testimony, but also provided documentary evidence to support his allegations. That's what he's saying. And then the third piece is what sent Mr. Cohen to jail, which is the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and other women leading up to the 2016 election, which many believe is a violation of the federal election campaign laws. Of course, we also have an investigation ongoing in the state of Georgia regarding Trump's now infamous call to then Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, asking him to, quote, find votes. So, you know, it's interesting you mentioned Mitch McConnell, and I do quote this in my Atlantic article. He said in his sort of stunning speech where he was almost apologizing for his vote to acquit on the second impeachment, he said, quote, we have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation, and former presidents are not immune from being held accountable by either one, end quote. So essentially what we're seeing right now is all accountability for the apparent wrongdoing in the Trump administration and by Donald Trump is being shouldered by the states and the state of New York, the state of Georgia, and the city of Manhattan. The United States Congress, the federal system, and presumably at this moment, we don't know anything that's happening in the Justice Department under Merrick Garland, but essentially the whole federal system, which is supposed to, in theory, the separation of powers, hold the presidency accountable, they're washing their hands of it. And because of the filibuster, because of the 60-vote filibuster to destroy legislation that is, even if it has bipartisan support, We might well see Mitch McConnell kill this January 6th commission in the Senate, even though all of, as reported, all of Minority Leader McCarthy's demands for a bipartisan commission were met by the Democrats. The Democrats are doing all of the compromising here, all of the negotiating to try to get to the bottom of this terrorist act on January 6th, and the Republicans are just saying no. So we need to see a lot of changes in government. This is another moment, in addition to the Voting Rights Act, where I think that the filibuster, it's not operating as a function of democracy anymore. It's operating to make it impossible to get any serious work done on behalf of the American people.
So, Kimberly, let me ask you, how are the prosecutors proceeding? Because it seems like they have leaned on Alan Weisselberg, Trump's longtime accountant, who apparently knows all the secrets and where all the bodies are buried. Now, his daughter-in-law has gone public, Jennifer Weisselberg, and are the New York Attorney General and the Manhattan DA's prosecutors, are they squeezing the kids to get to the father? How's it working, do you think?
Well, there's certainly, it was reported today that they have opened a criminal investigation. I'm not sure if this is accurate, but it's reported into Weisselberg himself. And just a little bit of background about Weisselberg. He worked for Donald Trump's father back starting in 1973. So this is a man who has a long history with the Trump organization, and he was the only non-family member, along with Trump's two sons, Eric and Don Jr., who was put as a trustee to hold Donald Trump's properties in trust during his presidency. He was also involved in inking the Stormy Daniels hush money payment, the $130,000 hush money payment that, as I said earlier, sent Michael Cohen, his lawyer and fixer, to prison. So Alan Weisselberg knows quite a bit. As you indicated, what we've also found out was that his son, Barry, has been on the payroll for the Trump administration in addition to Alan. And that as part of that, according to Barry's ex-wife, over $500,000 in tuition payments for Barry's children were paid by the Trump administration or organization and signed either by Weisselberg, the grandfather, or Trump himself. So they're circling. Certainly they're circling. And, this kind of financial trades, these financial transactions, they can be papered, they can be identified through, sort of the actual paper trail or electronic trail. But the question is the sort of knowing, intentional aspect of it. Donald Trump is the head of the organization. His own lawyers had put in writing that, he's the top person out over 500 entities that make up the Trump organization. But he's going to say, listen, these are my minions. I had nothing to do with this. So having Weisselberg be available to confirm Donald Trump's knowledge and walk through these documents is a critical element. And it's pretty typical for prosecutors to sort of try to get the lower hanging fruit to flip, so to speak, to become cooperating witnesses, to get to the top, which in this moment is absolutely Donald Trump. But it's impossible, honestly, Ian, to know in this moment how close they are to an indictment. And I'm sure this is probably the most serious case that has ever crossed any of their desks. They have to be not only 100% sure that an indictment is proper, but that they could actually get a conviction by a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And a former president, this is really, really serious business. I think a few years ago, people would say it's inconceivable to that it would just be unseemly to do this. But I think Donald Trump has violated so many barriers or so many guardrails of decency as president and as a post-president that there has to be some ticket for this kind of speeding through the guardrails of what we think is normal and appropriate behavior of a president of the United States.
And just in closing, it seems that the notoriously cheap Trump, who just disposes of people and doesn't pay his bills, and Rudy Giuliani learned that recently, he looks like he really did take care of Alan Weisselberg. And I guess in terms of squeezing him to try and get him to flip, he may be vulnerable to some exposures on not paying taxes on some of these monies that are being uncovered.
Yeah, I mean, that would be one potential line of inquiry, right? If sort of money was shifted around without, proper tax accountability for it. So yeah, the way to sort of pressure Alan Weisselberg would be to say, listen, you make what's called a proffer. This is the evidence that we have against you, against maybe your son. And this, of course, is complete speculation on my part. But this is how it would work in theory. This is what we have. If you agree to cooperate and talk to us, like Paul Manafort did, if you recall, in connection with the investigation of the 2016 Russian interference in the election by Bob Mueller. He later retracted that. But the idea is, this is what we have against you. If you cooperate with us, we will be very, very lenient with you in exchange for testimony that will put potentially Donald Trump in the clutches of the criminal justice system. That's a tremendous ask. But you're absolutely right. The idea would be, listen, we'll let you and or your children go free, or at least a much lower sentence, if you cooperate with us and give us the evidence that we need, because he does know where the bodies are buried here when it comes to the Trump organization.
Well, Kimberly Whaley, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me, Ian. I always enjoy chatting with you.
Well, thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Kimberly Whaley, who's an author, lawyer, media commentator, and professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. And she's also a former assistant United States attorney, associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation, and the author of How to Read the Constitution and Why, What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, and the forthcoming book, The Outsourced Constitution, How Government Power in Private Hands Erodes American Democracy. And she has an article at The Atlantic, The Country is on the Cusp of a New Era. America is inching closer to a possibility it has never seen before, the indictment and trial of a former president. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into a possible thaw in the frosty relations between the U.S. and Russia following a meeting between the U.S. Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister, and the waiving of U.S. sanctions on the Russian Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is William Pomerantz, who's the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute of Advanced Russian Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and he also teaches Russian law at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. Welcome to Background Briefing, William Pomerantz.
Glad to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And it does seem like the Biden administration is trying to thaw things out a little bit with Russia. There have been a couple of developments on the sidelines of the Arctic Council summit in Iceland on Wednesday. Secretary of State Blinken met with Soviet Foreign Minister Lavrov, and they seemed to have a fairly cordial discussion, and they're laying the groundwork for a summit later on between Vladimir Putin and President Biden. And then the U.S. waived sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 company and its chief executive, Matthias Warnig, who is a former East German intelligence officer. And that seems to have been something that the German government, Angela Merkel, was anxious to have happen. Obviously, it's getting some criticism from Republican circles, which we can talk about. But how does this strike you? Is there a thaw underway?
I don't think there's a thaw underway. I think there's a beginning of trying to find a way to tone down the rhetoric and to have a cordial conversation, as it were. Not necessarily a reset or cordial relations, but to find some way of communicating that can at least bring these two major powers back to the table. I've followed the various announcements in Russia leading up to this meeting with Blinken and Lavrov, and the soundings in Russia are just very negative in terms of accusing the United States of Russophobia, of trying to get Russia removed from the Security Council at the UN, and other really wild accusations. So if this is the beginning of a more civil dialogue between the United States and Russia, that is only to be encouraged. We'll just have to see what results from it.
Well, I've heard reports from Russian sources and former KGB officers that there's something of a power struggle going on inside Russia, with Putin being threatened from the right by Nikolai Patrushev, the very hawkish national security advisor. Have you heard anything to those effects?
I have not heard anything to those effects. Obviously, over the last 6 months, Putin has passed major constitutional reforms that have centralized power in the presidency and actually increased his power over the policy and also his position within the Russian Federation. If there is a game against Putin, it is very much in the shadows and has not been revealed as of this time.
Well, what explains, though, for example, the recent cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline, which, even though Biden said he attributed to Russian criminals, it's pretty hard to believe that the Russian criminals didn't have some kind of relationship. We know they do have a relationship with the intelligence services, simply because how do they know how to target such a critical piece of infrastructure? So I'm just wondering whether, is Putin still hands-on in terms of these somewhat aggressive actions, not just this one, but also SolarWinds?
Putin always has an element of deniability for all these different types of actions around the world, against opposition candidates, against major political figures such as Alexei Navalny. He always has a means to separate himself from the actions. And so I think that it's unclear to what extent Russian intelligence services are acting on their own interests or on their own initiative to please President Putin, or whether there is direct approval from President Putin. Putin always has preserved some element of deniability in all these actions, whether one believes that he's not consulted or not even in the decision-making process. There are many doubters, and I think that in many ways Putin must be aware of these situations because he is the one who has to respond to it.
Sure, and the Russian sources that I've talked to that have suggested that there's something of a power struggle from the intelligence services, the FSB, and from Nikolai Patrushev, suggesting that these are acts on the part of these sort of rogue actors, if you will, to make it difficult for Putin to have a summit with Biden. So but again, you can't take any of this stuff to the bank. And
exactly. There's many a conspiracy theory that has circulated around Russia because its decision-making is so opaque.
Right.
But there are not an immediate signs of Putin losing power in the short term. And there are no signs that he's not in control, ultimately, of the security services.
And again, I'm speaking with William Pomerantz, who's the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., who also teaches Russian law at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. So let's turn to the pushback against the Nord Stream 2 waiver of sanctions on the part of the Biden administration. And it's getting a pretty furious reaction. Needless to say, the Ukrainians are very unhappy because this pipeline goes directly from Russia through the Baltic, underneath the Baltic Sea, into Germany. So it cuts out Ukraine, and Ukraine was always getting transit fees. And in fact, it was a slush fund that Gazprom set up to control Ukraine through the corrupt politicians in Putin's pocket. So Biden obviously was listening to Merkel, not to the Ukrainians. Is that putting it simply?
I think that is true. The pipeline is 95% complete. Chancellor Merkel's on the way out, but she has been a staunch supporter of this pipeline, and Biden evidently did not want to contradict her.
And this is a pipeline that will supply gas to Germany and I guess to other parts of Europe. And the argument has been that it will make Western Europe too dependent upon Russia.
That's true, and it will increase the dependence on Russia for gas imports. There was already a Nord Stream 1 before there was the building and construction of Nord Stream 2, so Europe and Germany were already dependent on Russia for gas supplies. This will evidently make it more dependent, but and again will strike Ukraine, the middleman, out of the gas pipeline business, which is also what was Putin's intention. And so I think Biden inherited this problem, and he wasn't going to disrupt this pipeline. That would cause various problems with Europe. And even though Merkel is on the way out, he evidently didn't want to do that. There will be a significant backlash from this, however, both in the Congress, both in the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States, which votes and is highly vocal in its support of Ukraine. And obviously, it was just a few weeks ago that Blinken went to Ukraine and talked about the support of the United States for Ukraine and its territorial integrity. And here we are a few weeks later, and that guarantee, although still on the books, it's clear that the United States will go with its stronger European ally in this particular instance.
And in terms of domestic pushback against this move by Biden over the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, Jim Risch, who's the top Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, described Biden's move as, quote, a gift to Putin that will only weaken the United States' leverage in the lead up to an impending Biden-Putin summit. And then Michael McCaul, the top House Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee, said, if the Putin regime is allowed to finish the pipeline, it will be because the Biden administration chose to let it happen. It is a Russian malign influence project that threatens to deepen Europe's energy dependence on Moscow, render Ukraine more vulnerable to Russian aggression, and provide billions of dollars to Putin's coffers. So that's the pushback.
Yes, and I must say that if Biden wanted to approach the summit between himself and President Putin from a position of strength, maybe he wanted just to have the threat looming about potential sanctions over the pipeline. Indeed, it is rather strange if he wants to negotiate with Putin and Russia, and the pipeline provided him some leverage. It's very puzzling as to why he would sacrifice that leverage in the lead up of this meeting. Russia will very happily say thank you very much, and then will continue to go down its list of demands against the United States.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to keep going on without the conspiracy theories, but the theory that I've been told is that Biden's trying to help Putin. But
Biden has assumed the presidency and this issue after the fact that the pipeline has been largely laid, after the fact that the Europeans got all the approvals within the European Union and the neighboring countries to build this pipeline. The pipeline was built under someone else's watch, and the previous presidents did not stop it or did not put sanctions onto the pipeline. And Biden evidently made the calculation that he wants to strengthen his relationships with European allies, and to do so, it wasn't advisable to start by alienating Chancellor Merkel, even though she's on the way out.
So, if it's a loss of leverage, as you mentioned, and as the Republican critics say, then on the other hand, it might be a kind of a peace offering, because things are pretty bad, and you mentioned how hostile the Russian press is and full of all kinds of paranoid theories. This is, I think, overall a good positive development, isn't it? I mean, you can't have this kind of frictions going on and on between these two nuclear-armed powers, and you can't afford not to have them talking to each other. So that's a good development, obviously. So what do you see actually happening at this summit, assuming that the groundwork is now being laid and it's going to happen? What's going to be achieved?
Obviously, the achievements will have to be kind of negotiated before this summit. And I don't think that some of the long-standing problems of Ukraine, of Syria, and other places that are contentious between the United States and Russia are going to be solved within the next few months. It would be that would be a highly unlikely development. But the theory is that, get these two leaders head to head, have them discuss certain issues and certain hotspots, and maybe there can be some resolution to them. I do not see kind of a major change in Russian foreign policy. I do not see, for example, that the United States can dislodge the good relations between Russia and China. Again, the economic and political links between those two countries are pretty strong now, and I don't think the United States is going to be in a position to divide them. So again, there is an advantage for Putin and Biden to get together, but I think any sort of major development will be a long time coming.
So in effect, what's happening then is a bit of a cleanup for the total disaster that Trump was. I mean, in geopolitics, you're supposed to unite your allies and divide your enemies. And Trump did the reverse and fractured the alliances and drove Russia and China closer together. So there are some outstanding issues that could be dealt with. And in fact, a senior U.S. diplomat said this to CNN, that there's a range of intersecting interests, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, dealing with the nuclear programs in Iran and North Korea, and the situation in Afghanistan. So all of those would be on the agenda, would you say, William?
They would all be on the agenda, but if someone has a magic bullet, as it were, no pun intended, to solve these problems, these are long-standing, deeply divisive issues. And I don't think that a 1 to 2 day meeting between these two presidents are going to be able to resolve those problems. They can create a rapport and maybe begin the discussions as how to deal with these issues. But these are, as you previously said, these are problems that Biden has inherited, that are left over from the Trump presidency, and they took years to develop, and they don't lend themselves to simple solutions.
Well, William Pomeranz, I thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with William Pomeranz, who is the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And he also teaches Russian law at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back examining the signing today by President Biden of a law targeting hate crimes against Asian Americans. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Dr. Russell Young, who's a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and the founder of Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate, which tracks COVID-19 related discrimination in order to develop community resources and policy interventions to fight racism. He's the author of a number of books, including Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, Moving Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, and Sustaining Faith Traditions, Race, Ethnicity, and Religion Among the Latino and Asian American Second Generation. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dr. Russell Young.
Thanks, Ian. Glad to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us, and I imagine this has been a very gratifying day for you, given that President Biden signed a bill today on Thursday to address the growing number of assaults and other crimes against Asian Americans since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, we're really gratified. We're really grateful for the leadership of President Biden, Senator Hirono, Congresswoman Meng for initiating this hate crimes legislation. It helps expedite investigations. It helps provide community-centered solutions to the issue. And it also really addresses the political rhetoric that really stigmatized Asian Americans at the moment. You know, that term Chinese virus was really deadly.
Well, I've seen, and I'm sure you have, some terrible video footages of people being assaulted. An elderly woman in New York, brutally beaten, and people were just standing. I think it was even a kind of rent-a-cop security guard standing by doing nothing. A young man with his child in a stroller being savagely beaten in San Francisco. And a couple of women were stabbed in San Francisco, weren't they?
Yeah, it's really heinous. It's traumatizing. I think Asian American elderly are particularly vulnerable and frightened at the moment. I know a lot of Asian Americans are staying inside for fear of violence and for fear of racism.
And of course, there was the horrendous shooting in Atlanta, too.
Yeah, so we're still grieving over that. Plus Indianapolis as well. So hate crimes against Asian Americans has surged, as well as hate incidents. So not everything is a crime. A large proportion of the hate incidents that we've received, now over 6,600, are not necessarily crimes, but they are civil rights violations. They're traumatizing verbal harassment cases. They're racial bullying in schools. So the racism that this piece of legislation covers isn't fully addressed, and we need even more comprehensive legislation and policies.
And indeed, in the White House today, President Biden described the meeting that he had in Atlanta with the next of kin survivors of the victims, and he's described the meeting as raw and emotional.
It is. I mean, it cuts close to home for the Asian American community to see our seniors attacked. Again, even in the Atlanta shooting, they were seniors. So again, that's why we think this deserves national attention. It's a national issue, not an Asian American issue. It's a national issue of violence and racism.
So the vote to get this bill passed, it was signed into law today by President Biden. In the Senate, sometime a month ago, I guess it passed 94-1, and the one person voting against it was Josh Hawley. But in the House on Tuesday, the vote was 364-62, and I believe it was actually 63 Republican House members voted against it. Have you any idea, one, why they did that, and has any of them come forth with a reason why they would vote against such a bill?
You know, I don't really understand why people would vote against this. This is legislation calling for equality, to fight discrimination, to fight racism, clear American values for equality and justice. So I'm too perplexed why people would vote against this act, especially when such a large segment of the American community is being under attack. 45% of Asian Americans, according to the Pew Research Center, experienced this type of racism in the past year. So it's morally wrong, it's traumatizing, and it is, again, a civil rights concern for Asian Americans.
And again, I'm speaking with Dr. Russell Young, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and the founder of Stop Asian American and Pacific Islander Hate, which tracks COVID-19 related discrimination in order to develop community resources and policy interventions to fight racism. He's the author of a number of books, including Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, Moving Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, and Sustaining Faith Traditions, Race, Ethnicity, and Religion Among the Latino and Asian American Second Generation. So let's talk a little bit about the second generation and younger Asian Americans. According to polls, in the 2020 election, there were record numbers of Asian Americans voting, and those numbers were pushed up by the youth vote among Asian Americans. And it was apparently very important in states like Georgia, where Biden won narrowly and where the two Democratic senators won narrowly. So, first of all, is it true, Russell, that the Asian American vote has been percentage-wise rather low compared to other groups?
Yes, it's true that the Asian American voting rates are low, primarily because we're a largely immigrant population. And so it takes us longer to get naturalized and then to gain citizenship and then to understand, the complex political issues. But as you said, the second generation and those who are born here or grew up here are much more active politically. They've been motivated by racism. 63% of Asian Americans in the last election said racism was their primary motivation to vote. And clearly they came out to vote 2-1 for Biden.
Well, how are the Asian American community going to navigate going forward, though? Because obviously the U.S. relation with China is not in good shape. I mean, on today's program, we're talking about efforts to calm things down a little between the United States and Russia, with the two secretaries, Blinken and Lavrov, meeting on Wednesday in Iceland and setting up a summit. But no such thawing is happening on the Chinese-U.S. front. And Trump, of course, was absolutely reckless. You mentioned earlier his disparaging racist remarks about the Wuhan flu and the China virus, etc. But there is still friction between the Biden administration and Xi Jinping's regime, and it's not likely to lessen. So one of the things that was so outrageous about what Trump was doing was he lumped the Chinese people with criticism of the Chinese government. And the Communist Party government of the People's Republic of China is a very different kettle of fish from the Chinese people and the Chinese diaspora. So a lot of damage has been done, has it not?
Yeah, it's clear, Ian. It's that the bashing of China leads to the bashing of Chinese people in the U.S., that vilifying Chinese makes Chinese Americans the enemy and those who look Chinese the enemy. This is a long-standing problem facing Asian Americans, that foreign policy translates into our racial domestic position. So we understand that we should hold China's government's policies to be considered, that we should hold the Chinese government accountable. But you have to clearly distinguish the Chinese government and its policies from Chinese people, from Chinese culture, and from Chinese in the U.S. Unfortunately, people can't make that distinction. And by lumping and conflating these entities, again, that we see leads to anti-Asian violence.
So how do you deal with it going forward? Or how does Biden deal with it going forward?
We've recommended that the State Department really, again, make that distinction and sort of balance out critique of Chinese policies, balance that with expression of admiration and love for Chinese people and respect for the culture. You have to temper those type of statements and then clearly distinguish the two. I think you also need to collaborate on areas that you really should be collaborating on. Issues such as global warming, even trade, are concerns that benefit both nations. Our own economies are so inextricably connected that if one economy goes down, the other economy will also be impacted. So I think we need to really collaborate on areas where we need to, and then hold them accountable in areas where we disagree.
So in terms of the work that you do at the Stop Asian American and Pacific Islander Hate, which you're the founder of, Dr. Young, my understanding there's been, 6,600 anti-Asian hate incidents recorded nationwide? And that's the work that you've done, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we received over 6,600 incidents since last year. And again, they range. They're not all hate crimes. In fact, only 5% of the incidents are hate crimes, but they range from civil rights violations to online harassment to verbal harassment. We found really clear trends that have been consistent since last year. Vulnerable populations are being attacked so that women are attacked twice as much as men, and youth and elderly are also disproportionately represented. So again, this week I've been really concerned about our elderly because as they see the violent crimes against the elderly, they've really isolated themselves, have been, again, traumatized and acting with hypervigilance and avoidance. And it's been really an emotionally isolating and physically isolating time for our elders.
And in the bill signed today, it addresses hate crimes against Asian Americans, but what does it do in terms of deterring or preventing further attacks or punishing those that have engaged in this kind of violence?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a first step, and it does support funding for community-based solutions. And our solutions at Stop API Hate are really aimed to be preventative, to address racism before it reaches the level of hate crimes. So we want to promote ethnic studies, again, expand civil rights protections, provide more public awareness, especially in public transit where a lot of the incidents occur. So Stop API Hate, we're really recommending preventative measures that address the issue in long-term ways. Again, the racism is deeply rooted in America, so it's going to take a while to uproot it.
And in terms of American politics, you mentioned a couple of the Asian American politicians who have been helpful in getting this bill through and signed today by President Biden, Mazie Hirono, Grace Meng. You've also got Tammy Duckworth as well. Do you foresee more participation? And Judy Chu, I might add as well. Do you foresee more participation of Asian Americans? And we have Ted Lieu. In fact, Ted Lieu is my congressman.
Yeah, they've been very vocal, very upfront. If it weren't for these Asian American elected officials, again, I don't think the issue would have been addressed. Again, having Vice President Harris has been really instrumental in making this issue addressed. So as the Asian American electorate becomes more mobilized, I think we'll see more Asian American elected officials at the table and addressing this issue. So I think this is a really galvanizing moment for the Asian American community overall. I see a lot of pan-Asian unity. I see Asian Americans from all walks of life standing up to the racism. And I see us recognizing that we need to, because the political rhetoric has been so devastating, that we need to be engaged politically and civically, and that we need to have our voices heard and to be at the table.
Well, Vice President Harris actually spoke first today during the bill signing, and she said this bill brings us one step closer to stopping hate, not just against Asian Americans, but for all Americans. And then she went on to say that racism exists in America, xenophobia exists in America, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, it all exists. So she's taking a pretty strong stand there, and this is really something across the board that has to be dealt with, because more and more Republican legislatures are passing anti-trans bills, etc. So it looks like Vice President Harris she's taking the fight on, isn't she?
Yeah, she is. And again, she sort of embodies the intersectional nature of racism and gendered violence. I know we at Stop API Hate are really learning from Black Lives Matter to address this issue. We're really building off of the work of Muslims and South Asians and Arab Americans who experience Islamophobia. So we're gaining from their wisdom, trying to build upon that movement and to work in solidarity for racial justice for all. So again, I think this hate crimes legislation isn't just for Asian Americans, but it does support expedition of hate crimes against anybody.
Well, one hopes that those 63 Republicans who voted against this bill and the one Republican senator could be, smoked out a little bit. And why? What is the reason for opposing a bipartisan bill to stop this hideous behavior of scapegoating. And of course, if you go back in history, there's an unfortunate history, of course, of Chinese Americans and the Exclusion Act, etc. So we're supposed to have moved on since then, right?
Right. But I think they voted against the bill because they're appealing to their base. And nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiment has always worked politically in the U.S. Again, like you said, the yellow peril, the fear of Asians as taking away white workers' jobs, as being disease-ridden, was used in the 19th century effectively, and that led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It worked during World War II with the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and it's working now. It did help certain elected officials in the last election. So in some ways, jingoistic, xenophobic, racist language and behaviors are effective in the United States, and that's why it's employed.
Well, Dr. Russell Young, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for inviting me, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Dr. Russell Young, who's a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and the founder of Stop Asian American and Pacific Islander Hate, which tracks COVID-19 related discrimination in order to develop community resources and policy interventions to fight racism. He's the author of a number of books, including Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, Moving Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, and Sustaining Faith Traditions, Race, Ethnicity, and Religion Among the Latino and Asian American Second Generation. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon, and this program is available for podcasting at backgroundbriefing.org, where you can sign up for our email updates as well as subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this program, you can help us reach more listeners by taking a moment to rate and review us on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do share the program with friends and family and colleagues on Twitter and Facebook. And to help us sustain our mission and spread the word to keep us corporate-free and commercial-free, we have added a donate button. So if you're in a position to give support, please take a moment to visit backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible contributions will help us continue to build a reality-based community in post-truth America. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing. Bye for now.
Standing along the side of the pickup truck, a shot rang out in the night, just when everything seemed right. Another headline written down in America. The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared.